It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
As the ancient proverb goes, may you live in interesting times, and indeed, so we do. America under lockdown. Global power structures are completely out of control. The planet as a whole is under siege. Its life support systems are unraveling. I'll continue to carry out each weekly on-air broadcast with appropriate urgency, as if it were my last. Is there any good news? Stay with me. I'll get to it shortly. The commercial-free Global Alert News Hour starts now. To be covered in this broadcast, an internationally recognized virologist and his team share their findings on the true origin of COVID-19. Stay tuned. First breaking headlines of unfolding collapse. Search any of these headlines online to learn more. First headline, the American economy in 4 words. Neo-feudal extortion, decline, and collapse. Next headline, pandemic compresses brick and mortar meltdown, i.e. retail sales stores. Next headline, Fed officials suggest U.S. recovery may be stalling. Not stalling, it's crashing. Next headline, U.S. budget deficit hits record $863 billion in June, a 100-fold increase. How long can the snake eat its own tail? Next headline, cuts to basic services loom as coronavirus ravages local economies and sends states into fiscal crisis. Next headline, world's largest pension fund loses $163 billion in worst quarter ever. Another headline, gold tops $1,800 per ounce to highest level since September 2011. Again, the greatest commodities will soon be what you can eat, drink, and shelter with. Another headline, the collapse of the U.S. oil drilling rig count spells big trouble ahead. Next headline, Bed Bath & Beyond to close 200 stores over the next 2 years. It'll be likely much sooner than that. Another headline, Harley-Davidson to cut hundreds of jobs as part of turnaround strategy. Good luck with that. United Airlines sending, quote, gut punch furlough warnings to 36,000 workers. And this headline, California utterly failing as 2 million residents waiting for unemployment checks. Next headline, auto dealers and restaurants with ties to lawmakers were among the firms to receive the COVID-19 relief loans, Treasury reports. Another headline, televangelists and Dallas megachurch that hosted Pence approved for millions in pandemic aid. Another headline, how COVID-19 is accelerating the shift to a cashless society. That certainly serves the power structure. Another headline, the billionaires and country clubs that received small business loans from the government as COVID-19 relief. Another headline, why the Bill Gates global health empire promises more empire and less public health. Next headline, Europe faces deep recession and UK will shrink by 10%, says the European Commission. Next headline, British retail to lose further 5,000 jobs in another blow to the economy. Another headline, huge debt payments come at worst time possible for Canadian drillers. Footnote on that headline, the completely unsustainable and environmentally devastating fracking fiasco continues to unravel. Next headline, DHL to cut personnel and 2,200 UK workers at Jaguar/Land Rover factories to be cut. Next headline, falling off a cliff. Lebanon's poor borrow to buy bread. Next headline, Pakistan on the brink of COVID-19 financial collapse. Another headline, Belgrade protests over virus management turns violent. Next headline, Greece passes law regulating demonstrations. Thousands march in Athens. Another headline, COVID-19 pandemic in Africa is now reaching, quote, full speed. Next headline, Egypt arrests doctors, silences critics over virus outbreak. Another headline, as long as mass media propaganda exists, democracy is a sham. Another headline, The World Health Organization warns the coronavirus is, quote, getting worse and continues to accelerate. It will likely make sure that remains to be the case. And then there's this new report to consider from numerous sources. Churches and pastors are eligible for relief in stimulus package. Consider the following statements and cited facts from former U.S. presidential candidate and pastor, Dr. Chuck Baldwin. Quote, what is most disconcerting is the way pastors and churches grovel before these tyrants. For years, Dr. Baldwin states, I have tried to warn Christians about the evils of the 501c3 nonprofit government churches. He continues with this. In order to stay on the good side of the Internal Revenue Code 501c3, churches have sold their spiritual birthright and Bible convictions. They are happy to crawl on the floor and eat the crumbs that fall from the king's table, like dogs on a chain. Megachurches and other religious organizations with ties to vocal supporters of U.S. President Donald Trump were approved for many millions of dollars in forgivable loans from a taxpayer-funded pandemic aid bailout, according to a long-awaited government data report released this week. Of course, it's not just conservative Republican-leaning churches that are cashing in on the coronavirus scenario. So are liberal Democrat-leaning congregations. Again, the whole left-right, conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat fiasco is orchestrated mass distraction and division for populations. It always has been. Too many still succumbing to that. Many decades now past, Martin Luther King recognized the perilous trajectory of the human race. King stated this, quote, our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power. We have guided missiles and misguided men. Question, why do we think what we think? Who or what sources furnished us with our opinions, our perspectives, and our conclusions? Many are not even interested in knowing what is wrong in the world, but even in the case of those who know, is it enough just to know? Does it stand to reason and logic that the universe would require more of us than just to know? Is the personal attempt to make a difference for the better just an option? Or is it an obligation? Life is a gift. Would it seem rational and reasonable that this gift comes with a responsibility to the whole? So what is the good news I referenced at the beginning of this broadcast? Due to unfolding collapse and accelerating insanity on countless fronts, many are being forced to wake up and face the now nearly black horizon. Is that the best news I can come up with? In fact, yes. Many message me with statements like, quote, why don't you focus on the good things that are happening in the world, end quote. My response, like what? Here's my question. Is it possible that the passengers who were knee-deep in water on the deck of the Titanic were balancing their dialogues with compliments on the violinists, or how nice their evening meal was, the one they had moments before the hole was ripped in the bottom of the boat that was sinking at blinding speed beneath them? No, I wasn't there, but I rather believe that the passengers were solely and completely focused on the sinking ship, a ship on which their lives completely depended. And so should we be. We, all of us, are passengers on planet Titanic. The ship is absolutely going down. If there's any chance whatsoever of altering our current course, it will take all of our efforts, and we must focus squarely on the horizon before us. In a moment, the most critically important breaking headlines on the most dire threats we collectively face. First, I am compelled to thank each and every individual that is doing their absolute best to stay informed, to wake others with credible data from a credible source, and to help turn the tide. Thank you more than I can say. It is our collective efforts that can yet make a difference. This is Dane Wigington. You're listening to the Global Alert News Hour, episode number 257, July 11th, 2020. In this broadcast, news that covers the issues we must face if we're to have any chance of changing course. This commercial-free frontline news broadcast is brought to you by geoengineeringwatch.org and paid for by geoengineeringwatch.org. This news hour is broadcast throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM, Saturday mornings from 6 to 7 AM, Sunday mornings, same time slot, repeat broadcast. This broadcast is also re-aired on the East Coast, the PRN Radio Network, Wednesdays, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Recordings of this broadcast can be found at geoengineeringwatch.org under the recent top stories and radio sections. The latest geoengineeringwatch.org printed awareness-raising materials can be ordered from the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org for our approximate cost of producing and shipping. These are our most effective tools. A picture is worth 1,000 words, as it is said. Our printed materials contain dozens of images, including NASA satellite images that show absolutely undeniable climate intervention operations occurring. They contain copies of federal documents, illegal gag orders, gagging the nation's weathermen, the National Weather Service, and NOAA, and much, much more. We realize under the current conditions they can't be passed out in person, but they can be mailed out. Spot fires of awareness can be started in just such a way. From the onset of the pandemic, geoengineeringwatch.org stated on the record on numerous occasions that based on all available data, the infection rates would likely be strategically increased at a measured pace by the utilization of various tactics. For centuries, even millennia, the rulers have utilized fear to manipulate and control societies. This is not to state that real threats do not in fact exist, but those threats are again utilized to fulfill agendas. The more stress and anxiety that societies endure, the more malaise many become. All too often, the desperation to find a way back to the, quote, normalcy of the past overrides the sense of reason. Those in power continue to successfully drive yet more wedges into societies and populations. The divides are deepening on subjects like vaccinations and masks. Are they helping or hurting overall, for example? What does the AARP group, the American Association of Retired Persons, say about masks? And they're basing their data on CDC data. They state this: how to make a face mask out of a sock and fabric. So we're to believe that a sock will stop an aerosolized airborne virus? Really? From AARP.org, this myths about face masks. They state this. In this report from AARP, it is stated that the notion an actual face mask designed for the purpose of contamination prevention is not necessary. They say that this is only a myth. In fact, as already mentioned, AARP states that making a mask from a sock is fine. AARP states, quote, the advice from CDC is that the general public should wear cloth face coverings, not medical grade masks, which are best left for healthcare professionals on the front lines of the pandemic. They further state, quote, the CDC recommended coverings can be purchased from major clothing retailers, they say, such as The Gap and Disney. And they say, then sewn together and fashioned from everyday household items, such as bandanas or rubber bands or even, quote, socks. I will again remind that an ever-growing mountain of data proves the COVID-19 pathogen came from a lab, not from nature. Those that are behind this bioweapon or other more virulent versions of it, yet to be released, have a purpose. Protecting populations is not a part of that purpose. However alarming it may be to ponder the wider horizon, only by doing so do we have any potential to alter the destination that awaits us all, if we remain on the current course. Divides are also deepening in regard to the true origin of the coronavirus scenario. All official so-called public protection agencies and their corporate media partners are now labeling as, quote, conspiracy theories any and all information that in any way contradicts official narratives. Even peer-reviewed science reports are being censored and labeled as, quote, conspiracy theory, if they in any way dispute official narratives. Modern industrialized militarized society has now officially leapt headlong into the bottom of the abyss of unrestrained insanity, into the twilight zone. An all-out information war is unfolding. About this broadcast, the goal of Global Alert News is to motivate honest, objective, and thorough investigation of the wider horizon and the converging threats and catastrophes we collectively face. Reaching conclusions is, of course, up to the individual. If we base our conclusions on a thorough and unbiased investigation of all available data, the conclusions will stand a much greater chance of being accurate. In regard to examining all available data, from the original European publishing source, minervanet.no, that's minervanet.no, this new report, quote, the most logical explanation is that it, i.e. the coronavirus, comes from a laboratory. From the report, this internationally known Norwegian virologist Birger Sorensen and his colleagues have examined the coronavirus. They believe it has certain properties which would not evolve naturally. These conclusions are politically controversial, but in his interview, he shares the findings behind the headlines. He states, quote, I understand that this is controversial, but the public has a legitimate need to know, and it is important that it is possible to freely discuss alternate hypothesis on how the virus originated, end quote. Despite the explosiveness of his statements and research, Sorensen remains calm and collected. Sorensen has been a point of controversy ever since former MI6 director Richard Dearlove cited a yet-to-be-published article by Sorensen and his colleagues in an interview with the Daily Telegraph. The article claims that the virus that causes COVID-19 most likely has not emerged naturally. News outlets are thus confronted with a difficult question. Are the findings and arguments of Sorensen and his colleagues put forward of a sufficiently high quality to be presented and discussed in the public sphere? Question mark. Sorensen explains that they, in their dialogue with scientific journals, are encountering a certain reluctance to publishing the article. And listen carefully to this next statement by Sorensen. Without, however, proper scientific objections. Translation. Mainstream publishing sources are refusing and showing a reluctance to print any data or to even reveal to the public any data that disputes the official narratives, no matter how scientifically sound that data is. Let's stop there for just a moment to consider and remember we already have peer-reviewed science study from 2015 from the journal Nature and other sources to prove that the gain-of-function aspect of the COVID virus was engineered in labs in Wuhan and I believe North Carolina. We already have that. Why is there even a discussion on this issue at this point? The report from Dr. Sorensen and his fellow scientists continues. In the article, Sorensen and his colleagues describe what they claim is curious about the spike protein of the coronavirus, which makes it especially well suited to infect humans. These findings are the foundation of the hypothesis Sorensen and his colleagues, his fellow scientists, develop in the new article, where they claim that the virus is not natural in origin. Let's stop for a moment to consider this footnote. A spike protein is a part of the virus attached to the surface of the virus. The spike protein is used by the virus when it enters cells, enabling it to stick in humans. The properties of the spike determines which receptors a virus can utilize and thus which cells the virus can enter to create illness. The report continues, quote, there are several factors that point towards this, says Sorensen. Firstly, this part of the virus is very stable. It mutates very little. That points to this virus as a fully developed, almost perfected virus for infecting humans. The internationally known virologist then goes on to state this, quote, secondly, this indicates that the structure of the virus cannot have evolved naturally. When we compare the novel coronavirus with the one that caused SARS, we see that there are altogether 6 inserts in this virus that stand out compared to other known SARS viruses. Sorensen then goes on to explain that several of these changes in the virus are unique, and they do not exist in other known SARS coronaviruses, as stated. Quote, 4 of these 6 changes have the property that they are suited to infect humans. This type of aggregation of a type of virus property can be done simply in a laboratory, translation only in a laboratory. and helps to substantiate such an origin, Sorensen points out. Continuing, more than 90% confident. That's a subheadline. Sorensen is therefore confident that the virus has originated in a laboratory. He says, quote, I think it's more than 90% certain. It's at least a far more probable explanation than it having developed in this way in nature. He continues, the properties that we now see in the virus we have yet to discover anywhere in nature. We know that these properties make the virus very infectious. So if it came from nature, there should also be many animals infected with this, but we have still not been able to trace the virus in nature at all. The only place we are aware of where an equivalent virus to that which causes COVID-19 exists is in a laboratory. So the simplest and most logical explanation is that it comes from a laboratory. Those who claim otherwise have the burden of proof, Sorensen says. Another subheadline in the report, critical voices suppressed. There are indeed earlier known experiments where changes to the coronavirus have been engineered. An interesting example of this kind, the report states, of research is in a collaborative effort between Wuhan Institute of Virology and the University of North Carolina, as I stated a moment ago, at Chapel Hill. In 2015, a science report from numerous sources describes experiments in laboratories that created coronaviruses, so-called gain-of-function studies. Been over that in many previous broadcasts. The purpose of this research is partly to be better prepared, that's the stated purpose, for new pathogenic variants of the virus, but the researchers also write, quote, the potential to prepare and mitigate future outbreaks must be weighed against the risk of creating more dangerous pathogens. The risk must also be evaluated in light of previous known accidents where coronaviruses have escaped from laboratories in China, and for the record, elsewhere, like Fort Detrick in the U.S., just prior to the COVID outbreak beginning. Another footnote and reminder on the subject at hand. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, quote, gain-of-function studies refer to research which is the attempt to increase the ability of a pathogen to cause disease in humans. The method is controversial because it entails risks such as viruses escaping from labs. Between 2014 and 2018, this kind of research was prohibited in the United States, but in December 2017, under the current administration, American authorities announced that the ban would be lifted, and so it was. The Sorensen report continues with this. Several researchers have already pointed out that artificially created viruses would be easy to identify. We, therefore, the authors of this report state, ask Sorensen why this has not been identified earlier. Sorensen believes that there are several reasons for this. He states, the first is that this is a very uncomfortable finding, and the production of new scientific articles that can be used to prove such findings has all but ground to a halt. Chinese scientists no longer publish articles that can be used to support this hypothesis, again, that CV-19 is absolutely from a lab. Sorensen continues, quote, to do my analysis, I have therefore had to go back to the source of material and look at these articles that were published before the COVID-19 outbreak. When asked about why there has not been more debate on this topic, Sorensen has several explanations. Quote, this quickly becomes a discussion on politics rather than science. Sorensen responds. He states, quote, nobody wants to put forward the inconvenient truth. Many scientists are also concerned about their own funding and position if they were to put forward such a controversial hypothesis. Sorensen further states, it is nevertheless a fact that many people on the web have engaged in such a debate. But so far, those who participate in such forums are characterized as, quote, conspiratorial. It is also the case that debate about this type of viral research and the technologies used may damage reputations and lead to new restrictions on how to conduct molecular genetic research. With this in mind, it's not hard to see that it must be difficult to get accepted papers in peer-reviewed journals that focus on such research. So what's the bottom line condensed summary? Those who control the flow of money control the narrative. Should come as no surprise. As the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic continues to come to light, one sobering statistic is spinning heads. According to nonprofit research data, the vast majority of Americans who have died with COVID-19 are nursing home residents or individuals suffering with unrelated life-threatening health problems. Consider this headline: Nursing homes effectively used as petri dish for COVID-19 thanks to misguided government decisions. From that report, if there's any indication that the United States officials flubbed the response, is it really an accident? You decide. To the COVID-19 pandemic, it is the fact that nursing home residents, which make up fewer than 1% of the country's population, have accounted for 45% of COVID-19 related deaths so far from the time of this report. The statistics were revealed in an analysis produced by the nonprofit group, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. According to a discussion about the study on Forbes.com, quote, this figure could even be an understatement, primarily because many states like New York do not count the deaths of nursing home residents as, quote, nursing home deaths if the residents died after being sent to a hospital despite contracting SARS-CoV-2 at their facility, the nursing home facility. Other states are admitting to grim realities, with Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania reporting 50 to 70% of their state's COVID-19 deaths occurring among nursing home residents. Again, should we consider how those that are vaccinated fit into this equation? Just prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, how many remember the big pharma push to vaccinate the elderly with a flu vaccine that was advertised as being 4 times more powerful than the standard flu vaccine? I haven't seen that TV commercial in several months. Have you? Perhaps I've just missed it. And there is this to consider. Before the statistical mass mortality was reported in Italy, there was a mandatory new type of vaccination administered there. Perhaps just another coincidence. COVID brain damage now being reported. Consider this new headline: Scientists warn of potential brain damage linked to COVID-19. That's from Fox News LA. From that report, scientists warned on Wednesday of potential brain damage linked to the novel coronavirus, including severe neurological complications such as delirium. Question: how many horrific effects is the COVID-19 supervirus capable of? Or again, should we consider the possibility that new and more virulent versions are being let loose, as those who wield power choose? Exactly who are the controllers? And what do they control? Consider this new headline. Quote, new documents reveal more serious conflicts of interest at the National Institute of Health. Subheadline: the National Institute of Health owns half of vaccine corporation Moderna. What a surprise. By Robert F. Kennedy Jr., chairman of the Children's Health Defense. Kennedy states, new documents obtained by Axios and Public Citizen state that the National Institute of Health, the NIH, owns half the key patent for Moderna's controversial COVID vaccine and could collect half the royalties. In addition, 4 National Institute of Health scientists have filed their own provisional patent applications as co-inventors. Little-known National Institute of Health regulations let agency scientists collect up to $150,000 annually in royalties from vaccines upon which they worked. Reward the obedient minions for the power structure. That's how the system works. Kennedy's report continues. These rules are recipes for regulatory corruption. Most certainly they are. More from Kennedy. National Institute of Health's stake in the vaccine may explain why Anthony Fauci moved Moderna's vaccine to the front of the line and let Moderna skip animal trials despite the experimental technology and the inherent dangers of coronavirus vaccines. The report continues. Every prior coronavirus vaccine has proven problematic and can be lethal to animals due to COVID's unique penchant for pathogenic priming, i.e. the vaccine is like an internal ticking time bomb. More from the report. Public health advocates and scientists criticize Fauci's decision to skip animal trials as, quote, reckless. It may also explain why Anthony Fauci arranged a $483 million grant to Moderna from a sister National Institute of Health agency, BARDA, that's the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, despite the fact that Moderna has never brought a product to market or even gotten approval to do so. Never. Not once. Kennedy continues, Fauci publicly announced he was encouraged, quote, by Moderna's catastrophic phase 1 clinical trials, despite the fact that groups of super healthy volunteers had grade 3, quote, severe or medically significant reactions following vaccination. Fauci's infusion made Moderna CEO Steve Bancel a billionaire, in addition to further enriching Fauci's mentor and co-investor, Bill Gates. This scenario may also explain why Fauci publicly announced he was, quote, encouraged by Moderna's catastrophic phase 1 climate trials, despite the fact that 20% of the high dose and 6% of the low dose groups of super healthy volunteers had grade 3, quote, severe or medically significant, end quote, reactions following the vaccination. Those results would have spelled dead on arrival for any other medical product. After getting the abysmal news, Bancel, the CEO of Moderna, and 4 other Moderna executives immediately dumped more than $89 million in stock, and Fauci was forced to make his, quote, optimistic public assessment to save Moderna's plummeting shares from the death spiral that they were in. Fauci did his best to paint lipstick on Moderna's lame donkey experiment vaccine, and now he's trying to convince everyone it's a thoroughbred. Moderna and the National Institute of Health began manufacturing the first of 1 billion doses of the deadly vaccine this month. Fauci knows from experience that no matter how dangerous a vaccine is, the easy part is convincing people to take it. Pharma, after all, controls the media. What a profound paradox we face. No matter how deceptive and deadly the, quote, system has become for populations, so many in populations are still fighting to defend this very system. Or should I say matrix? Question, how many strains of COVID-19 are there? How many will be let loose in populations? MedicalNewsToday.com asks this question on this theme. COVID-19, quote, how many strains of the new coronavirus are there? Question mark. From the Houston Chronicle and other sources on this same theme. This headline, quote, evidence growing that Houston's main coronavirus strain is more contagious than original. From that report, evidence is growing that a mutated coronavirus strain, the main one circulating in the Houston area, is more contagious than the original virus in China. Imagine that. About China, in addition to the COVID issue, China recently warned of the potential danger of a new swine flu epidemic potential, as already reported on an earlier Global Alert News broadcast. Now, there's this new headline from numerous sources. Quote, China reports suspected case of bubonic plague and warns of a, quote, epidemic risk. And there's this from Apple News and other sources. Chinese officials warn of unknown pneumonia in Kazakhstan that is deadlier than coronavirus. Question, did a random act of nature suddenly release a plethora of completely new pathogens on populations all over the globe? Or is something else entirely going on? You decide. Back to the power structure, divide and conquer strategy from MSM.com and other sources. Masks are putting people at each other's throats, especially in Palm Beach County, Florida. From that report, little about the pandemic has generated as much consternation as masks, even given almost universal medical evidence, only from reports published in 2020, by the way, I'll get to that in a moment, that masks help stop the virus from spreading. And this reminder from the AARP report cited earlier in this broadcast, even, quote, socks for masks, end quote, are apparently fine for stopping an airborne aerosolized virus. The Palm Beach report continues with this, quote, the popularity of social media and the country's giant political divide have created an environment where mask agitation thrives. Again, in regard to the report's statement that, quote, almost universal evidence exists that masks stop the virus from spreading, end quote. All the science reports that come to any such conclusion about masks, and coincidentally about hypoxia, seem to have been produced in 2020. I'll get to that in a moment. First, this from Harvard Health Publishing. Quote, not a staycation. Isolating at home affects our mental health. Again, no surprise. Harvard is certainly a power structure-controlled institution. All too often, those in power seem compelled to announce what is coming, like Dr. Fauci's 2017 statement on film and on the record that, quote, a surprise pandemic would occur during this presidency. More on isolation. This recent report from ScienceAlert.com. Quote, isolation has profound effects on the human body and brain. Here's what happens. From the report, loneliness can be damaging to both our mental and physical health. Socially isolated people are less able to deal with stressful situations. You're also more likely to feel depressed, and many have problems processing information. This in turn can lead to difficulties with decision making and memory storage and recall. And for the record, all the above mentioned further depresses immune function. On that note, from Psychology Today, this report, quote, depression hurts the immune system. And this report from Fox News, quote, silent hypoxia may be killing COVID-19 patients. So, mainstream media acknowledges that hypoxia is a problem. Question, can the prolonged wearing of face masks contribute to hypoxia? Reason and common sense would certainly lead to the conclusion that rebreathing our own exhaled air would logically contribute to a reduction in blood oxygen levels. Prior to 2020, numerous science studies were produced that also came to this conclusion. But now, just since 2020, there seems to be a sudden explosion of studies that say, no, not a problem. You can now apparently rebreathe your own exhalations all day long, even through a sock. No problem. What's next for so-called science reports? Will we be told that wearing a bag over our heads is fine also? Are there circumstances and scenarios when wearing a properly designed mask is appropriate and protective? Of course. But how much of what I just described is actually what is taking place in societies at this point? i.e., the proper utilization of the proper mask in the appropriate circumstances. That's not what's occurring. This question, does wearing a mask induce stress? Stress causes a cortisol release. What does stress and excess cortisol do for immune systems? Both suppress immune function. This fact is well documented and not scientifically disputed. And now let's add this 2012 report from the Smithsonian Magazine. Quote, carbon dioxide in a crowded room can make you dumber. From the report, we have always had a dogma that carbon dioxide itself at the levels we find in buildings is just not important and doesn't have any direct impacts on people, end quote. Berkeley lab scientist William Fisk, a co-author of the study, told phys.org, quote, so these results, which were quite unambiguous, were surprising, i.e. disputing the former notion. The report continues. As part of the study, they put forth 4 participants at a time in small office-like rooms for 3 periods, each 2.5 hours long, with a 1-hour break in between. For each group, they pumped in enough pure carbon dioxide to achieve 3 different concentrations in the air, 600, 1,000, and 2,500 parts per million. The Smithsonian report then states this. For reference, the air outside typically has a carbon dioxide level of around 380 parts per million. For the record, it's now about 420 parts per million since the time this article was produced. Report continues, but because we exhale the gas when we breathe, levels indoors are generally much higher. In crowded classrooms or meeting rooms, levels frequently reach 1,000 parts per million and sometimes exceed 3,000 parts per million. Report continues with this. Although the researchers suspected the participants' abilities might diminish slightly, they were surprised by how significant the effects of the carbon dioxide were. Decision-making decreased moderately at 1,000 parts per million, as measured on 7 of the 9 scales, with decreases ranging from 11 to 23%. That doesn't sound moderate, does it? That sounds extreme by itself, but it gets much worse. Report continues, and significant decreases occurred on those same scales at 2,500 parts per million, with decreases of 44 to 94%. The most dramatic effects were found in the participants' ability to engage in strategic thinking and take initiative. What a massive red flag that is. That fact would certainly seem to be advantageous to those in power. An extreme drop in, quote, the ability to engage in strategic thinking and take initiative, end quote. The Smithsonian report continues with this, quote, the magnitude of effects measured at 2,500 parts per million was astonishing, they say. So astonishing that it was almost hard to believe, end quote. That's from Berkeley lab scientist Mark Mendel, co-author, and this is what he told Science News. The Science News report then continues with this. Until now, scientists assumed that carbon dioxide had to be present at much higher concentrations to have a direct effect on human health. Quote, previous studies have looked at 10,000 parts per million and 20,000 parts per million. That's the level at which scientists had previously thought effects started. The Smithsonian report finishes with this statement, quote, that's why these findings are so startling, end quote. And now, as already stated, since the start of 2020, we suddenly have a number of new reports stating exactly the opposite. That it's fine to breathe through whatever material you can find all day long, and that it will stop viruses somehow, no matter what the material is, even a sock, and that breathing through it all day long is not a problem. Does that make sense to you? Should that make sense to anyone? Let's consider this question one more time. How many COVID positive cases and COVID mortalities were individuals that routinely got vaccinated? Here's the headline to remember and consider. This one was from disabledveterans.org and other sources. Quote, flu vaccine increases coronavirus risk 36%, says military study, end quote. And for the record, the peer-reviewed study referred to in this article was posted in Science Direct. Sadly, fear-driven behavior is continuing to fuel the current course of the majority that are turning two blind eyes to the mountains of data that conclusively proves we are all being herded toward the edge of the abyss. In fact, in many ways, we are already over the edge. Climate and biosphere collapse are the tidal waves towering over our heads. The climate engineering onslaught is further fueling the process. It is exactly because of these factors that the controllers will continue to stoke the COVID fire and the official narratives relating to it. With this in mind, the concerted attempts to censor critically important information continues to be ramped up. Now, anything that in any way doesn't conform to the official narratives is being targeted. The following statement is from YouTube, from a heading, COVID-19 Medical Misinformation Policy. This statement, quote, YouTube doesn't allow content that spreads medical misinformation that contradicts the World Health Organization. There you have it. Simple. Those in power increasingly insist that we accept every deception they dish out. How deep does the deception go? Search and view, quote, American Moon, and decide for yourself. Just one shocking and verifiable example of deception on an almost inconceivable scale. One more example of colossal deception is the continuing official denial from all official agencies, all elected officials, and the whole of academia, the denial of the climate engineering elephant in the sky. We cannot know how profoundly climate engineering operations have further contributed to the unfolding planetary meltdown, unless or until the weather warfare programs are brought to a complete halt. The science community continues to tell us that the aerosol masking effect, even though they say climate engineering is not going on, is slowing the planetary meltdown. But is this actually true? No. Not when all the downstream consequences of the highly toxic solar radiation management jet aircraft spraying is considered, including the fact that solar radiation management particulate canopies trap more overall heat than they deflect. And microwaving the atmosphere, which is how these particulates are manipulated, further generates atmospheric heat. This recent report was issued from YaleClimateConnections.org. Quote, some new climate models are projecting extreme warming. Are they correct? Question mark. From the report, recent climate models are, quote, running hot, projecting catastrophic global warming. Puzzled scientists are weighing whether the models need correcting or whether severe warming is a real threat. And that's typically what the power structure does. With the CO2 studies I just went over, with how dangerous is ionizing radiation that was downgraded by 10,000% after Fukushima, so suddenly you could be exposed to 10,000% more radiation without causing harm. We are truly living in an asylum that's run by increasingly out of control and criminally insane power structures all over the globe. If a larger percentage of the population doesn't summon the courage to wake up and fully face the horizon, it will soon be game over. Newsflash, severe warming is not just a threat, it's already an unfolding reality in numerous and rapidly increasing locations all over the world. And all the while, the climate engineers continue to interfere with Earth's life support systems on every imaginable level. Much of the Yale report focuses on the effect of global cloud cover, and of course the ongoing global climate engineering atrocities were completely omitted from the report. Silvery white skies are now what many call, quote, clear, but they are not. The skies are all too often so full of particulates that natural cumulus clouds over distant mountain ranges are barely visible. On my last broadcast and numerous others, I've made mention of the statistical rate of warming on planet Earth, the heat or thermal energy equivalent of over 400,000 Hiroshima-sized nuclear bombs per day, over 90% of it having so far been absorbed by Earth's water bodies, primarily oceans. But since we know that so much of the science community is completely controlled by governments or corporations, how can there be any confidence of the statistical data regarding the rate of Earth's warming? Shouldn't we ask that question? Because in this case, there are countless forms of frontline empirical factors, empirical data, that are inarguable in this equation. In regard to the skyrocketing planetary temperatures, most especially water bodies, remember and consider that a cubic meter of seawater can contain 4,000 times the thermal energy as a cubic meter of air. The polar meltdowns are being captured on countless reels of film footage. If we lose the Arctic, we lose the world. Those that are willing to decide by what they can see with their own eyes should view the shocking, internationally award-winning documentary, quote, Chasing Ice, available online for, I believe, $3. When viewing the film, consider that the blindingly rapid implosion of polar ice, the planet's cooling system, has increased its melt rate exponentially since the time the film was produced. The current course of the human race is pushing us all toward near-term planetary omnicide. More headlines from the UK Independent and other sources. Quote, climate crisis. Siberia's record heat wave forecast to continue during July, raising major fears over wildfires and Arctic heating. The report states exceptional warmth after the hottest winter ever is a, quote, warning cry, scientists state. How desperate are some to slow down the melting of Earth's ice deposits? Consider this recent headline from theweathernetwork.com. Quote, Italian ski resort covers glacier with tarps to slow melting. From the report, long sections of the sheets are unrolled down the mountain and then sewn together to prevent warm air from slipping underneath. The report then asks this, should reflective blankets be used in the Arctic? Question mark. Are we to take such ridiculous questions seriously? Like the 10 million wind-powered water pumps that the so-called science community has proposed as a way to save the Arctic? All nothing more than completely insane proposals from the inmates in the asylum? A quick check of a few global weather headlines. Dam hits highest level causing 1,000-year flooding in Manitoba, Canada. A warming atmosphere can hold more moisture. 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. The greatest disrupting factor regarding the hydrological cycle at this moment is climate engineering. This is not to say that we wouldn't have catastrophic weather events without climate engineering. We will. Unbelievable events because there's so much pressure built up in this system that's being hindered from a natural process of finding equilibrium, hindered by climate engineering more than any other factor. Another headline, extratropical bomb cyclone lashes southern Brazil, leaving 1 million affected. Another headline, more than 1.4 million affected as flood situation remains severe in Assam, India. A few more headlines from our neighbor to the north. Catastrophic Alberta bee population losses blamed on cold winter pandemic. Welcome to engineered winter, climate engineering, and toxic winter precipitation. Another headline from the north. Most northern tip of Canadian Arctic sets June temperature record. No surprise. The report states intense heat and dry spell shows no sign of letting up in Canada. Another headline, forest fires continue to ravage Quebec as authorities hope for rain. Good luck. That's in the hands of the geoengineers. Another headline, severe summer storms in Finland leave 60,000 homes without power. Another headline, severe flooding affects more than 1 million in China's Hubei. Another headline, California enters deadly wildfire season with over half inmate firefighters under COVID lockdown. The report states as California's deadly wildfire season approaches, over half the state's inmate firefighters are currently unavailable to serve the northern half of the state. That doesn't bode well, does it? Month after month, year after year, temperature records keep being broken. Last July was the hottest month ever recorded, and 2019 was the second hottest year on record. It was actually the hottest, but statistics are being falsified to the downside. The The 5 last years have been the hottest on record officially, as was the decade from 2010 to 2019. The 5 warmest decades on record have all occurred in the last 5 decades, and each successive decade was warmer than the preceding decade. We've seen 425 consecutive months of above average surface temperatures and 43 consecutive years of above average global land and ocean temperatures. Since the 1970s, global temperatures have risen an average of 0.2 degrees C per decade. It's much higher than that. These are falsified radically to the downside. And for the record, atmospheric CO2 content is now the highest it has been for at least 23 million years, and that's not taking into account methane, which is an even bigger problem. Another headline: much of the U.S. is baking under record heat. A heat wave forecast for the U.S. has scientists alarmed, and so they should be. Another headline, I'm running out of time. From the Anchorage Daily News: fish are more vulnerable to warming water than scientists previously thought. Everything across the board is much worse than scientists supposedly thought. We knew at geoengineeringwatch.org. How come they didn't know? They did know. And the only reason they're disclosing it now is because they can't hide it any longer. From imlive.com, that's in the Great Lakes region, this headline: Great Lakes water temperatures warming, quote, off the charts. Some regions are already over 80 degrees. And this headline from sfgate.com: never before seen bacteria kills 60,000 fish in California. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife said that fish-to-human transmission is possible. This happened at the Mojave Fish Hatchery in Victorville, California. I've been to this hatchery numerous times. Another headline: catastrophic elephant deaths mystery. Hundreds of elephants had dropped dead in Botswana, and no one knows why. The scientific community never seems to know why things are happening, and perhaps that's their task. In far too many cases, paid by the power structure and the corporate empire. I'm almost out of time on this broadcast. I want to recite this excerpt from the documentary Earth and the American Dream. Quote: for centuries we have lived as if our fate were separate from the fate of the earth. But no people, no country can separate their own fate from the fate of the earth. So many indigenous cultures of the past spent ample time contemplating their connection to the whole. They were not distracted by iPhones and manufactured political theater and idiocy. And now we have pandemics adding to the equation. Last week I felt compelled to retreat to the wilderness for a day. Though in years now long past I spent so much time in solitude there, the battle at hand has all too often kept me from my former sabbaticals. Long after dark, on the bank of the Pitt River, last week I laid on my back and gazed at the stars overhead, embracing the clarity that is now all too often obscured by our filthy particulate-laden skies. Only the faintest silhouettes of the surrounding mountain ridges could be seen in the darkness. I pulled off my boots, pants, and shirt and dove into the river. I continued to stare at the heavens. Being immersed in such a source of life-giving water has always been very invigorating to me, no matter how battle-fatigued I otherwise am. I swam back to the shore and sat silently. Small ripples in the water could faintly be heard lapping the shore. A sudden splashing took place at what sounded like multiple locations along the riverbank. I reached into my pants pocket for a small flashlight, and turning it on and directing the beam of light south along the shore, to my astonishment, a continuous line of highly reflective eyes, wrapping down along the riverbank as far as I could see, as far as the flashlight would reach. Literally hundreds of small bullfrogs were stationed right on the shoreline, all staring back at my light. I've never seen so many, and this in spite of the increasingly hostile conditions faced by the entire web of life. I was mesmerized. So as not to blind them, I turned the light off, but I could feel their presence. So many frogs, so many. The kin of my frog friends in Lost Lake. All is connected. All is a part of the whole. A miraculous web of life that is far beyond true comprehension. So long as any members of the web of life fight to survive, we must fight alongside them. It is incumbent upon us to give a voice to the voiceless. Their future will also be our future, will also be our fate. All is completely interwoven. All is inseparable. All is connected. No matter how dark and ominous the looming storm before us is, if we choose to, we can face it with unyielding resolve, and if we collectively do so, we may yet be able to make a profound leap in the right direction, even at this late hour. Share credible data from a credible source. Make your voice heard. Make every day count. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org.